Hi class, today we're going to be talking about CAP papers. I'm going to try to give you some sort of helpful tips about how to write them, how to be successful, what I'm looking for, what I'm not looking for. To let you know, I have posted 3 or 4, I haven't decided, sample papers on Angel. So if you go to content, there's a little folder there with sample papers in them so you can look at them. Now, they're not the exact assignments that you'll be writing on in the class, but these are the same type of papers, same word limits. I asked for the same kind of introduction for those papers, the structure I'm asking you. Same kind of balance in terms of descriptive and argument. So they're very similar. The only difference is that those are different topics than the ones you'll be writing on. But those should help you get a sense of what I'm looking for. None of the sample papers received a perfect score, so I don't want you to think the sample papers are perfect, but each of them received an A grade, and I think that they'll serve as sort of exemplar papers. So let's talk about CAP papers, critical assessment papers, due every Sunday before midnight. Big picture. I said this a little bit in the syllabus. It deserves repeating. Big picture, I want you to spend 50 to 60% of your time really articulating the view of the author for that week, or of a particular theologian or philosopher, right? You're really saying, okay, well, here's what Corcoran has to say about dualism. Here are some of the arguments he gives. During this first 50 to 60%, you want to use quotes from the text for that week, a few short quotes. I don't want the whole first half of the paper to be all quotes, but a few poignant, well-placed short quotes that say, this is what Corcoran says, see? Here's where he says it. This first 50% of the paper where you're describing someone else's view or describing the view of a particular group, you want to be clear. You want to get to the point. You don't want a lot of fluff. You want to hit the heart of the argument, the relevant points, and really outline them so that I can tell you understand it. I mean, that whole purpose of that first 50 to 60% is for you to write in a way that explains the view so that I can say, oh, look, that student understands what Aristotle is saying to some extent. They can articulate that. And then you move into the last 40% of the paper where you say, and here's my argument. This is what I want to say in the paper, right? And then you articulate that view and you support that view and you defend that view using principles of critical reasoning, using maybe outside research, maybe things you've read in other classes, and you're going to really develop this argument. What are you trying to say in the paper? What is your voice? You're going to give that the last 50%, 40%. Part of the trick of these CAP papers is finding that balance, right? Where are my hands? There they are. Finding that balance between describing someone else's view and making your own argument. So that's sort of big picture, what I'm looking for. The first paragraph is vital. It is the backbone of the whole critical assessment paper. And I want first paragraphs to look a particular way. Not second paragraphs, not the start of the second page. The first paragraph needs to look a particular way. Philosophy is about being clear and concise. It means at the beginning of a paper being upfront about what you plan to do. Your intro paragraphs should function as an outline for your paper as a whole. So I need to have a clear thesis statement in your intro paragraph, a very clear thesis. And that tells me what you're going to argue. What is your overall point for this paper? What is the ultimate telos or goal of this paper? One sentence, that's your thesis. The intro paragraph should also give me 4 sentences, maybe 5, that really outline how you plan to make that argument. What major steps are you going to take to make your case? So the thesis statement tells me what you're going to argue. The next 4 sentences after that are going to tell me how you plan to make the argument. But if you put those two things together, you've essentially given me an outline for your paper as a whole. I want it to be clear. I want there to be enough detail so that I know where the paper is going. There should be no surprises. I know the major movements this paper will take after one paragraph. And then the question is, how well do you accomplish what you say you're going to accomplish? How well do you do what you say you're going to do? If you can write a really well-crafted intro paragraph before you start writing, that means you're clear about your strategy, you're clear about where you want to go, and almost always papers are better as a result. If you're not clear about what you want to say, and you're not clear about where you're going to take the paper, then the paper ends up rambling, going a lot of different directions, and really lacking focus and clarity. So that first paragraph is vital. It's going to take you a while to really think about, what do you plan to argue? How do you plan to make that argument? Right? Outline some things, jot down some thoughts, and then really construct it. Now, after you construct an intro paragraph, you start writing your paper, things might take a different turn. Just go back to that first paragraph and make the appropriate changes so that it matches what you actually do in the paper. But I think that's a good tool for how to write philosophy papers. I'm going to take one of the sample papers here and put it up on the screen to show you what a good intro paragraph looks like. All right, so this is a sample paper, and I'm going to use my little clicker here. This particular paper was about original sin, looking at the theologies of both Augustine and then John Wesley. So let's look at this first paragraph. The doctrine of original sin is the doctrine of original sin is the most common approach by Christianity or by Christians to answer the problem of evil. So why is there evil in the world? Of course, original sin. Championed by St. Augustine, who we had read for this week, original sin states that humanity has a propensity toward what is morally wrong. This tendency to sin comes from the first act of sin committed by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, as told in the Old Testament book of Genesis. So right now, this person is sort of outlining the first part of the paper. They're sort of outlining this traditional Augustinian view, right? When Adam and Eve disobeyed God by eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they brought pain, sickness, and both physical and spiritual death to humanity. What would happen if Genesis chapter 3 were read figuratively rather than literally? And this is the key, right, to the paper. It is my intention, here's the thesis statement right here. It is my intention in this paper to refute the doctrine of original sin. That is the what of the paper. They're going to sort of reject the traditional notion of original sin. Then the next part. I will do this by first reviewing. And here comes the outline for the paper. Here comes the how I'm going to make the argument. I will do this by first reviewing the verses in the books of Genesis and Romans that are quoted in an argument for original sin. Following that, I will give an overview of the issues with a literal reading of Genesis 3. I will then conclude with an alternate view influenced by the Jewish understanding of the narrative from Genesis, as well as, and he should probably say here, theology from John Wesley. I give a clear thesis. I have a clear outline. I know where the paper is going. I know the major philosophers that will be pointed to and theologians. I know Augustine's going to be used. I know John Wesley's going to be used. I know the major verses that are going to be quoted. So there's a lot of detail in just a few short sentences that really frame the paper as a whole. This is an ideal first paragraph and something that you should all sort of aspire to. All right. So now that you have written you've gotten your outline, you've written your intro paragraph, something to continually consider as students when you're writing these papers, narrow the scope, narrow the focus, narrow the focus. The one major thing that hampers students in writing these papers that are very short, 1,150 to 1,350 words, right? You want to hit that mark, in between that mark. Very short papers, what hinders students is that they want to say too much. They want to give me 4 different arguments for their view. They want to go in this direction and then in that direction. They want to give me 3 different examples, 5 different passages of Scripture. And so the paper is so jam-packed, and what happens is, Each of their arguments, the surface gets skimmed, just the surface. And so no depth. It's just one paragraph for this argument. The next paragraph starts a new argument. The next paragraph starts a new example. And the paper is very discombobulated as a result. All those arguments might be about the same topic. But what I'm looking for is a focused thesis, where you're going to make one major point in this paper. There's one major thing that you're trying to do. And the whole paper is working towards that one goal. If you're going to use an example, great. I love examples. Use one really good, thought-out, elaborated example. The best kind of examples are not simply personal. You can use personal examples, but I'm telling you, the best kind of examples are historically documented examples. So there are lots of examples in history that have been analyzed, thought through, read. If you can use those examples, it's going to make the strength of your argument much better than if you say, well, one time my son said X, and that made me think humans were sinful or something like that. So you really want to use documented examples, but use one good one. I want to see one major argument that's constructed, right? Because if you focus in like that, now you have to dig deep into that argument and support it. But that's uncomfortable. I don't like to do it. Students don't like to do it. And so as a result, the temptation is to say, well, I'm just going to write a bunch of different arguments, skim the surface of what I already know sort of off the top of my head without really having to dig into the meat of it. That's why I'm going to give you lots of feedback like this. Narrow the scope. Focus it so that each paragraph is intimately connected to the next, and it's sort of unraveling this larger thought that you're trying to communicate in the paper as a whole. So really make sure that you narrow the focus. A few other points that I might make. Another problem students run into is they make the majority of the paper a report about Aristotle or Plato or Augustine or N.T. Wright, and they give me 90%. Here's what N.T. Wright says about Christian character. And then at the very end they say, oh, and I agree, and they sort of tack on this voice at the very end. That will hurt your grade immensely. A lot of the grade is about strength of argument, hearing your voice, hearing you support your own voice. So you don't want to do that. The other problem I've just mentioned, students want to say too much, and so they push 5 different arguments in the span of 500 words, and there's just not enough time to elaborate. So try to avoid both of those and find that nice balance. Describe another's views, articulate it, short quotes, transition into your own thoughts on this particular topic. Writing. Some of you struggle with writing. You know that you struggle with writing. That's fine. We have a support center on campus, a writing center that will look at papers, give you feedback, get back to you with that. I encourage you to utilize those resources that are free to you. Have someone that you trust read it, a spouse, a friend, give you feedback. Read it out loud to yourself before you submit it. If you read your paper slowly out loud to yourself, you often catch mistakes. 50% of them maybe. It just doesn't sound right. So work on the writing. That will help you a lot. Use of scripture. It is not enough for you to say, I believe X, right? I'm a dualist, and I'm a dualist because Galatians chapter 3 says, and then that's the extent of your argument. Like, well, I just quoted the Bible, so that settles it. The Bible is a wonderful book, inspired by God and filled with truth, but it also has to be understood and interpreted. And people throughout the centuries have read and understood it and interpreted it differently. Even really good, well-meaning Christians disagreed with one another. Wesley and Calvin disagreed. Martin Luther and other Catholics disagreed. Tons of that. And so if you're going to use scripture, that's fine. But you really want to make sure you support your view or your use of that scripture, giving me biblical scholars, theologians, and others that utilize scripture in this way that can help support your point, right? Support your view in this way. So that's essential. But if you're going to use scripture, that you end up supporting your view of scripture, your interpretation of that particular passage with commentaries scholars and theologians that are going to really give a full body view, right? People that speak Greek, know Hebrew, know the history and culture, and they can really sort of highlight some salient features of the passages used. I hope this helps. The CAP papers, when I grade them, I grade on 2 criteria: writing, which includes grammar, and structure and things like that, and then strength of argument, your ideas. I grade much more heavily on ideas and arguments. When I say the argument, that includes how well organized is it? How well do you support yourself? Did you have a narrow focus? Was the intro paragraph clear, right, and succinct? So you've got all those sorts of things that are the major part of your grade, and then a supplementary part is, did your writing distract from your ideas? Was I constantly looking at your grammar, misspelled words, and things like that? So those are the 2 basic things that I'm looking at. So as you write, keep that in mind. If you have any questions, let me know. I hope this is helpful as you begin to write these papers. And I look forward to getting to know you better online.